Hi, Amazon sellers. This is Chris McCabe of e-commerce Chris. I'm a former Amazonian and a merchant account consultant. I'm here with Molson Hart, who is well known in the seller community. You're a seller and you're a sometime author, right, of articles.
Yeah, sometimes I put my fingers on the keypad, write some things.
That's great. No, I read your Medium post and I thought we could talk about that. The influx of Chinese sellers in the Amazon marketplace, how it's impacting um, sellers who are in the United States competing with China-based sellers, but also you're looking to see if the laws are ever going to change, right? Outdated laws to deal with e-commerce aren't doing any favors to buyers who are buying items that might be unsafe or counterfeit from Chinese-based sellers. So I thought we could start there. And then beyond that, I saw the Marketplace Pulse article, I think that came out a couple days ago, how the number of sellers who are China-based selling in the US has now overtaken the number of US based .com US sellers. So I'm sure you saw that.
I actually did it, but
Okay.
that's insane, and it's pretty consistent with what's been
Mm-hmm.
happening over the past couple of years, and it's consistent with what I wrote in the article.
Yeah. Amazon's been denying, I think the previous number wasn't 40 something percent of the US
Mhm.
sellers are China based. I think it was 38%. And they were saying that that wasn't realistic and that what that number wasn't based on actual data. So there's some dispute about how many, what the percentage is, but I think we can all agree that it's a lot of sellers that are China based selling in the United States.
Yeah, so Chinese sellers operating in the United States should be at a disadvantage. American sellers should have a home court advantage by virtue of understanding the culture, knowing the language, knowing how
Right.
business works over here. But in reality, they have basically a huge advantage, and that advantage can be split up into two categories. The first is they have a fair advantage, or what you could say is a fair advantage. I mean, they got cheaper labor, they're closer to factories, they can iterate on product faster. So that kind
Right.
of gives them an advantage, but that's not something really to complain about. That's just is what it is, right?
Right.
Kind of like we speak better English, do better marketing. But they also have a whole bunch of unfair advantages. They can't be sued, which
Mm-hmm.
if they get in trouble, they don't have to pay money because China doesn't enforce US judgments. And there are a lot of peculiar things around that that make it actually unfair for American sellers. And as you said, unfair for American consumers when they purchase products from a Chinese seller and they don't have any recourse if that product injures them in some way.
Right. And Amazon might give you your money back, but you might need more than that back, right? And Amazon doesn't accept liability for what sellers sell on the site. Maybe that'll change because they recently lost that federal judgment about whether or not they had any liability. The dog leash, right? The dog leash that
Right.
snapped and blinded
Mm-hmm.
a woman. So that's maybe open to dispute too in terms of what's coming in the courts and the pipeline. But for now, what we see is, like you said, the laws are outdated. If you sit down with congressional representatives or legal experts, they're going to say that what's written and legislated into the law is not enforceable. Like you said, it's way behind the times. It doesn't accommodate what happens in global e-commerce. But what about Amazon's role in this? Because Amazon actively promotes events in China, right?
Yeah.
They have thousands and thousands of people showing up. They send people from Seattle to talk about advantages that Chinese sellers might have over US sellers. That's been the hot topic in my circles. So I'm just wondering if you've thought about that, but also heard chatter and talked to sellers about, kind of protesting the advantages that Amazon's interested in providing to China-based sellers that are selling in the US.
Yeah. So what I always say is that Amazon is the master of the legal, but not the ethical. They're pretty good about walking about, like, not breaking the law, but sometimes they do
Right.
some things that are unethical in some ways. So Amazon takes a 15% cut of every product sold, whether it's counterfeit or not, whether it causes someone to be blinded as a result of, that product being unsafe or not. And that under the current law is legal, but I'm not sure if it's really ethical.
Mm-hmm.
Amazon seeks out Chinese sellers because they offer the best pricing. And even though Amazon has crushing market share, like they have huge market share in the e-commerce space. They still have to compete with eBay. They have to compete with Wish. They have to compete with Walmart.com. And for eBay and Wish, to a lesser extent on Walmart.com, there are Chinese sellers on there. And American consumers, they want cheap stuff. And the best place to get cheap stuff is directly from China. So, Amazon needs to seek out those Chinese sellers in order to get the best pricing and kind of cut out the middleman as they see it, which I think that perspective is wrong. And so they seek out Chinese sellers, and that's why they have larger events in China than they do in the United States.
Yeah. And now those events are better known, I think, in the selling community and by maybe even the American public too. That was behind the scenes, not in China. In China, it was well known. But here, people didn't understand that executives were going to China and speaking at these events and promoting selling in the U.S. The political climate now, and I think the awareness around this now, makes it more likely that people will understand that that's going on. And I think there's going to be more backlash against it. But what form will the backlash take? I mean, sellers aren't shutting down their accounts and going off to sell much less on their own websites as a result. I mean, buyers don't seem to be slowing their buying so much. But do you think they will start questioning, well, maybe this seller doesn't belong on Amazon. Maybe I should scrutinize these storefronts more than just looking at the prices?
I don't know what's going to happen, but I think that the best way to solve this issue is through new legislation that addresses basically the difference in where technology and globalization have taken us versus where the law stands. And that's why I wrote that article. I also think there's an increasing sense amongst the American public, amongst legislators, amongst competitors, that something is not quite right in e-commerce, and maybe something is not quite right with how strong and powerful Amazon has become. So I think that people are looking for ways to kind of address that. And there's something palpable when you see into a UPS truck and all you see is Amazon packages. You just feel that like something's maybe a little bit off about that. Yeah. And then now you don't even have a UPS truck. You have an Amazon delivery truck that's making deliveries to your home. So I think the way to solve this problem is through legislation. And I do think, though, that we might see some trade action from the FTC, but I have no idea. And I do think that we'll see the courts continue to try to interpret the current laws creatively in order to solve this problem, because people are getting hurt and American businesses are also getting defrauded by what's going on.
Right. Well, Amazon's big concern right now is showing the world that they can police counterfeit and reduce counterfeit on the site. So some of it's for show. For definitely, they get aggressive with suspending sellers for inauthentic items, or they force sellers to prove authenticity with invoices, with verifiable links to supplier websites and so forth. But are Amazon investigators really able to distinguish a counterfeit item or listing for a counterfeit item versus one that's a legitimate product that's been legitimately sourced just by asking for invoices or just by beefing up their SOPs or their tools? I mean, are they really able to separate good apples from bad apples is a question I get a lot. And so results are mixed, right?
Yeah. So here's what I would say. I would say that the United States has a court system for a reason. We have judges that are appointed by the president, approved by the Senate, and we have that, and we don't outsource it to India, and we don't outsource it to private companies because our founding fathers thought that this was the best way to do it, and that system is the most respected in the world, and it's been that way for 200 plus years. I think that Amazon does a decent job, but they have perverse incentives because, as I said, they make money off of unsafe product and they're seeking out Chinese sellers. And, maybe it's not a politically correct thing to say, but everyone knows that 99% plus of the problems are coming from Chinese sellers. So when you're outsourcing it so Amazon has different incentives from the court. The U.S. court system is about justice. Amazon is about making as much money as possible and spending as little money as possible on figuring this stuff out. And I do think that when an article comes out, they'll make a superficial change. Maybe they'll suspend the seller who was featured in the article, or they'll clean up the review or something like that. But I think that figuring out who's counterfeiting who and who's infringing on what IP is hard. Two, Amazon doesn't put it, legally they're not obligated to pour money into it. They kind of just do it because they want to look good and stuff like that. And I think that really the solution of this problem is to shift, who's committing trademark infringement, who's counterfeiting, to the court system. I mean, that's why we have a court system. Why are we trying to have Amazon, a tech company that outsources the work to India, effectively creating a kangaroo court? Why are they making the decisions?
Right.
Sorry.
They might not be challenged in legal terms, though. I mean, however the court cases pan out, I don't know if legislation is the answer, just because, I mean, that has to be proposed by a particular lawmaker who's got problems that constituents in their district report to them that they can act upon. I mean, they have to have the incentive to go after a giant like Amazon. And I've, heard about, there have been clients of mine or sellers who have talked to representatives in Rhode Island and in Illinois. And I know some of those conversations have taken place and they're very interesting to me, but proposing legislation, I mean, making sweeping changes to laws around e-commerce, I mean, that could be years or like a decade away, right? So,
that's true, but I'm optimistic. So I think that if your congressional district has an Amazon fulfillment center in it, good luck trying to get that guy to sponsor or that woman to sponsor your legislation. But I'm generally optimistic that the laws in e-commerce will change, because what's going on is totally messed up. And people are coming to terms with that. And the only people who are not in favor of this legislation are actually just maybe Amazon and Chinese companies that don't vote. So I think that
there are a lot of US based companies that are submitting false IP claims and abusing Amazon systems. I mean, I don't know if I agree it's like 99% Chinese, because we've seen lots of our clients attacked by US based sellers who are just looking to abuse loopholes and gaps and process and SOPs. So that's a global problem to me.
I would argue that it's definitely, so it depends on what problem we're talking about here. If we're talking about intellectual property infringement and counterfeiting, I feel pretty confident sticking with my 99% on China. Mm-hmm. For unsafe products, I don't know if it's 99%, but it's up there, and it's definitely disproportionately Chinese. For false IP, it's like you said, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. But it's important to remember that. So again, I don't think the Amazon should be the person, the entity that's just determining who's infringing on who. I think it should move through the courts, and that's what I'm proposing in my law. And so that problem will be solved there. But it's important to remember that in America, if I'm caught making a false IP allegation, there are major economic consequences for that. I have to pay money to the person whose products were wrongly removed. And I'm not exactly sure. In some cases, I'm committing fraud, which could mean I can go to prison. If you're a Chinese entity doing those two, engaging in that behavior, falsely alleging IP infringement, what are the consequences? There are none. Yeah. And so if there are no consequences, you know that you're going to get more behavior out of them from that. So it's not just necessarily some sort of like cultural issue that's going on in China. It's also that there's a stronger incentive for foreign entities to engage in that behavior, so they do it more.
Yeah, the only possible consequences right now would be losing your seller account because you've abused IP reporting processes and you've submitted false infringement claims. But Amazon hasn't been removing those sellers as often as they should for making those false claims. For a while, we saw a lot of code of conduct suspensions, or you've been abusing, the notice team process, we're taking you away. We only had a handful of those that we heard about, and then that seemed to recede into the background. So they do know that they have some power over that, and they can reduce some of that, but they don't stick with it. They seem to it's like very trendy, very cyclical. Is that something you've noticed?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what we were saying earlier. The article comes out. The seller who was featured in the article is suspended. That area is cleaned up temporarily. I mean, I don't really understand. I mean, I think that, like I said, you show me the incentive, I'll show you the behavior. Amazon doesn't necessarily have an incentive to clean this stuff up beyond making the optics better. Right. And something that confuses me a lot about Amazon is that like on the one hand, like if we're talking about Alexa, if we're talking about like what they're investing in, Amazon's like, yeah, we've got AI that can do everything, we can do machine learning processing on language, and we can figure out
Mhm.
all this stuff, and we got this amazing system to do all these amazing things. But then they're like, oh, it's trademark infringement, counterfeiting, can't do that. And
Right.
like a lot of this stuff is like pretty basic in order to prevent, and they don't take some of the basic steps that are necessary in order to prevent it. And
Mhm.
so it's just so I don't know. I'm confused, I guess, by what their position is on it exactly.
Well, you talked in the article about product liability insurance. Sellers should be forced. I mean, I wouldn't say just China-based sellers, but everyone should really be forced to have product liability insurance to ensure the safety of their items, right? Before selling
Uh,
on Amazon. I mean,
I
that is one
I
solution.
I disagree. I think that foreign sellers need product liability insurance, but American sellers, it should be their choice as to whether or
Mhm.
not they need product liability insurance. And I can explain why. If I if my company sells an unsafe product, I potentially stand to lose my company. And depending on whether or not I was engaged in it, whether or not I was committing, if I knew that the product was fraudulent, I'll personally lose a lot of money. That's not the case for sellers based in China or sellers based in Pakistan or countries
Okay.
that don't enforce US judgments like the United States does.
Mhm.
So I have a lot of downside risk, and that downside risk ensures that I make sure that my products are safe. So, to me, it's a personal choice. It's a company choice as to whether or not I want to carry um, product liability insurance. But for Chinese companies, we absolutely need them to have product liability insurance, because if someone loses their eye to a dog leash, they
Right.
get no recourse, right? Unless the
No.
judge, and this is totally gray area, determines that Amazon is liable, because in most
Okay.
cases Amazon is found to be not liable. The person who loses an eye gets, like you said, a $20 refund. So in my opinion, I think we need to require these foreign sellers to carry product liability insurance. It's also worth mentioning that it is required in the Amazon contract that you hold product liability insurance of sellers of a certain size, but Amazon does no enforcing.
They
So
don't do the enforcement. Yeah. So
interesting.
what do you think is the next, I mean, what is your next step? I mean, you wrote the article, you're interested in acting locally or trying to get more leadership involved in terms of legislation changes.
Sure.
What do
So
you, yeah.
basically, I need to find a congressman to
Hmm.
sponsor the law. And once that law is sponsored, then it's something that people can hang their hat on, that say, "Hey, I support the." This is embarrassing, but I can never remember what I called this law. The Online Business and Consumer Fairness Act.
Right,
I
right.
support that, right? So congressman needs to kind of like step up, say, I'm going to take the risk. There's not a risk in supporting this law. I believe that it's the right thing to do. And then once that's there, then we can ask sellers to support it, tell their congressman that they support it. And from there, we can look at lobbying groups who'd be interested in supporting it as
Right.
well. There are a lot of lobbying groups who'd be interested in supporting this, because like I said earlier, pretty much everyone is in support of these general, you know, consumer safety concepts and protecting American businesses. It's a bipartisan thing. It's just, we got to mobilize people behind it to make it happen.
Yeah, no, there's consumer agencies and consumer protection bureaus that are already in place. So seems like it would be an easy sell for them. Well, we look forward to hearing more updates from you. And when you begin your own congressional campaign, let us know. We'll follow that with interest. I'm here with
Uh,
Molson Hart. Yeah, well, you never know. It could be a couple of years away. It could be 5, 10 years away. It depends on where this Amazon stuff takes you, right?
yeah, I don't know. I'm all about our business via heart,
Mhm.
right here,
Right.
and selling Brain Flakes, which is our building toy brand, and Tiger Tail Toys, and all the good things we do. And we'll see what happens.
Great. Well, and I'll include the link to your Medium post at the bottom of this video for people to read the article and decide for themselves where they come out on it. So, thanks again for joining
Awesome,
me
man.
today. Yeah, I'll talk
Thank
to you
you so
soon.
much for having me. And thank you so much. It was a real honor to be able to do this. It's always good to
Mhm.
speak to you. And thanks for everything you do for sellers and all that.
Doing my best. We'll keep the conversation going.